friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Hello and welcome back, Rewind friends. This is Andrew Nunn, your podcast host for today. Joining me today is the other half of our co-lead pastorate, Kirk Giles. Welcome, Kirk.
Hey, Andrew. How's it going?
It is going, you know what, today is a good day. It's snowing. I've been able to skate on the rink a few times this past weekend. I'm feeling good.
Snow and Kirk are rarely a good day together. So,
Shannon posted recently a picture on Facebook of a snowstorm. I think it was like 2014 or 2016.
Yeah.
You up to your hips.
yeah, it was really a lot of fun.
So-
There are days where I wonder why God called me to Canada. Like,
Yeah, Hawaii would have been a much
Hawaii-
more desirable.
I hear the Lord's voice if it's Hawaii. Absolutely.
He just landed you here. Sorry, dude. You got at least a few years to run this one through.
At Promise Keepers, we used to joke all the time about starting Promise Keepers Bahamas or something like that. And I felt that I was being led to do that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
taking over the national director role of
That's right.
an organization that doesn't yet exist.
Exactly.
Okay, all right. Well, speaking of things that frustrate and anger you, that was the topic at hand today. And I think this emotion series has been really, really helpful and poignant. And I think I've said a few times on the podcast, like God has just been so gracious to us, especially over the last 6 or 7 months. I've seen him bring together sermon series ideas that are, 4 months old in our brains, but he brings them right at the right moment.
Yeah.
And we're at a moment in this world where tempers are a little higher than
You think?
than I've seen them in a while. And I just thought, yeah, God was very wise and sovereign in bringing this conversation here today. So I just wanted to, before we get into the breakdown of it, just say thanks for how well you handled that. And then ask you how you applied the learnings on Sunday night after the Sunday morning.
See, you got to bring the football game into. So here's the thing. I'm a huge Bills fan for those of you who are listening and don't know that.
Don't know why I'm bringing up
And that's a
Sunday night.
football team for those of you who don't know football.
Right.
And we were in the AFC Championship game
You were there?
I was part of it. I felt the energy, and we lost.
You collectively.
But you see, you have to look at it glass half full because it was a good season.
It was it was a miracle season.
Yeah, way better than we were expected to be. So, hey, I'll take it.
All right. Okay.
I'm good. I'm good.
Don't end in,
I
it's
didn't
like the
throw
2016 Leafs where I'm like, hey,
I was
everything's
closer
gravy.
to throwing things at my cat than I was at the television on Sunday. I'll just put it that way.
Speaking of cats,
Yeah.
I've got some ideas. You threw this out on Sunday.
I did, yeah.
About the how do you deal with a cat?
Yeah.
So I too have had a cat wake me up, pooping on me, in my blankets while I was sleeping.
Ooh,
It's an outside cat now.
I bet.
But I'm saying this is the solution for Junior,
But
your cat. You just
see, here's the problem. So I had a few people send me messages with some ideas, and every one of those ideas would have probably or possibly landed me in divorce court. So I
know a good lawyer.
I couldn't follow through on any of them.
That is a joke. Just please don't send me an email. That was a joke. Also, thank you, Brenna Stats, for all of your legal needs.
That's right.
No, I'm. For those of you, if you know me at all, you know that I am not in any way, shape, or form a cat person. So you're railing against cats. I'm like, I don't even have a cat, and I already hate this cat. There's no reason for me to, but I start there. So I needed your sermon on Sunday to heal the brokenness within me.
I'm glad it could help you in that way.
All kidding aside, though, as someone who has wrestled through anger on occasion, I thought this is a really brilliant and helpful conversation because, you come from a background in men's ministry, and not to paint with too broad of a brush, but typically men are more likely to struggle with anger as their keystone sin that they wrestle with. And that for me has often been the thing that flares up. So I've listened to a lot of sermons and podcasts and stuff that are completely under nuanced in this. Just stop it, right? It's not helpful, or heap on shame, or anything, or don't lead you anywhere, but just like call out the sin, but just sort of leave you holding your own problem and going like, all right, so what do I do with this now? So I was really thankful. I know you said that you sort of walked away from that and been like, I should have done this better. Or, I wish I had.
Yeah, I struggled with it for a few days after, right up till Sunday morning. I was sharing with our elders Sunday morning before we prayed together that after I recorded the sermon, I really struggled with the kind of what ifs and I should have done this or should have done that, and wasn't sure how God was going to use the message or if it was going to be any good. I actually told my dad not to watch it because I didn't think it was going to be good. So I appreciate the kind words and the encouragement.
Yeah, and I think what set the tone really helpfully was that this is not a story that you're unfamiliar with. This you've walked this road before, and I've only known you the last handful of years as your family moved forward and you stepped into eldership, and now you're my boss. So I've got to walk this road, and I never would have said like, man, that Kirk Giles, he's kind of an angry dude. Like that's never been on my radar. I've always been wonderfully pleasant and patient, and anger would have not been a word that would have been even in the top like 25 descriptors of you as a human being. So that's evidence that the Spirit of God has been working in you. And I think it would be helpful podcast fodder if you would walk us through that story a little bit more.
Sure.
Of, what happened.
So I think the first time I really recognized that I had an anger problem happened when our oldest son Carter was about 4 or 5 years old, and he was doing what a 4 or 5 year old will do.
Right.
And
PB&J in the VCR or something like that.
All that kind of stuff, right? And so I just finally reached my boiling point with him one day, and being the big bad man that I am, I decided just to start yelling at him. I mean, I yelled at him to such a degree it was almost like an out of body experience, where I was like watching myself yell at this 4 or 5 year old kid.
Just a runaway train, like you can't stop it.
And Carter backed himself up against the wall of our home, and I kept coming at him and yelling at him. And then I saw in his eyes fear, and I thought, I got to back down. I got to dial this back. So when I went to try to dial it back, I knelt down to try to give him a hug, and Carter went like this. He moved his head to the side because he thought I was going to hit him. That was his like gut reaction, was Dad's coming at me. And it killed a part of me inside, where like in my heart, I'm like, what have I done to my son? And in that moment, I knew I had a problem. I knew something needed to change. And I wish I could say that it all changed in an instant. It didn't. But that was my catalyst towards change. And I think that as so often happens with God's work in our life, a lot of times things don't just change in a split second. They're a progression of baby steps over time, and God changing our hearts and changing our lives. And for me, it really has changed the more, first of all, that I talked about on Sunday, receiving the grace of God, of understanding that I actually deserve God's anger because of that anger. But instead of giving me anger, he gives me grace. And really allowing that grace to grip my heart and change who I am slowly over time has been huge. And part of that too has been coming to the place of finding a sense of peace in who I am as a child of God, as a son of God too, because I found that a lot of my anger was oftentimes about my reputation. Like if my kid would just behave to a certain level, then people would think I'm a good dad.
Right.
But his misbehavior, like when he's sitting in church and he's yelling and screaming, everybody must think I'm a terrible dad. And so my anger is actually more about, in those moments, protecting my reputation than it is even just being angry with my son. And so the more that I came to grips and came to a sense of peace of who I am as a son of God, the more that those kinds of issues of worrying about my reputation, worrying about how people viewed me, all that kind of stuff kind of dies down a bit more. But I'll be honest, like I still get tempted with it. Like I still have those moments where I can feel the blood boiling and I can feel myself kind of moving towards an inappropriate response to anger. And so I just have to keep disciplining myself to catch myself in the process.
I like how you said that, an inappropriate response to anger. So it's anger in itself is not necessarily the problem,
Right.
but it's an inappropriate response.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
anger.
I mean, that's where I talked in the message on Sunday in Ephesians 4. It says, be angry and do not sin. And the fact that Jesus got angry in the story we looked at in Mark
Right.
11 tells us you can be angry without sinning. And even to the point where there is a place for anger because it's actually an expression of what God expresses anger himself. And as an image bearer of God,
Yeah.
feeling anger is part of, I think, God hardwired us with a sense of feeling anger at certain situations.
And I thought perhaps the most helpful insight for me through that sermon was reminding me, because I've heard this before, but it was just a helpful reminder that anger is actually a secondary emotion.
Yeah.
And just for me to like ask that question, why am I so angry? And to not just take the first response, because my kid's not listening, or because that guy cut me off in traffic, or because the line I snuck out early today, tried to get some groceries before work started, and there was the lady walking painfully slowly in front of me. And I could feel sort of the blood pressure start to rise. And I actually stopped, and I had the mental process enough to say, like, why am I angry here? She's probably like in her like late 60s, early 70s. She's going to walk slower than, a guy in his mid 30s who's in a rush, right?
Yeah.
Like that's life. Like that's what happens. But to say like, hey, my rush doesn't make her a bad person.
No, it doesn't.
I shouldn't be angry at this woman in front of me who's like
right.
meandering and talking to the lady in front of her.
I read a story from a guy who had anger problems sitting in traffic, commuting to work or whatever, coming home from work, and he's sitting in traffic, and he just was watching people not really driving well, and he would get angry, and he kept asking himself the question, why am I so angry? Why am I so angry? And his story is that God actually brought him to Psalm 23 and said, really, if you were just to maybe take this and understand that God is at work in every moment of your life, and to be able to go, maybe God's giving you the gift of a traffic jam for you to stop and slow down and actually just spend some time with God. And so instead of feeling this, I've got to rush more, I've got to do more, maybe your anger at the traffic jam should stop, and you should think about that God is your shepherd who is actively involved in everything in your life, and this is a moment where he is bringing you beside still waters to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been asked that question a few times recently, like, what if God was up to something here?
Yeah.
Instead of losing your hat and like totally blowing your lid on it.
Yeah.
What if God was up to something here? And you have to look below the surface sometimes, right? Because you can just be like, oh, but that guy's driving poorly, or this lady keeps walking so slow. It was so slow.
The thing, I think you're right. It's a secondary emotion. And in our rush, sometimes we go, so why am I angry? And we come up with an answer. And my comment would be, your first answer to why you're angry is probably not the real reason. Right. And neither is your second or third answer.
Okay.
You probably just need to keep asking yourself the question, why does that bother me? Why does that, so if it's this issue and you go, why does her walking slowly bother me so much?
Yeah, because I'm going to be late for my Zoom call this morning.
Right. So why does it bother you so much that you're going to be late for your Zoom call this morning?
I don't like to be late.
But why don't you like to be late?
Because I'm embarrassed.
Right. See, and so the more you just keep asking the why question, and you start diving in a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper into what's really going on in your heart. Jesus taught us that all of our sin is really an expression of what's going on in our heart. It's not first and foremost a behavior problem. It's a heart problem.
Yeah.
And so asking the why question always gets to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. If I was to sort of after good counseling from, professional counselors and wise counsel in my life, a lot of my anger comes down to embarrassment, fear, or insecurity. Like those three things. Like if you have to ask 7 or 8 questions to actually get to that level, it's because a lady in front of me was really slow or whatever. But when you get down to that, it's, why do I hate when my kid is screaming in church?
Yeah.
Because I'm embarrassed that I don't, as a father, have enough control over my child.
Right.
But there's theological implications of things like that, of like, does a loving father have control over his children or influence? And what's the difference, right? Like there's, anger just seems to expose and ask a million questions for me. It
sure does. Yep. Yeah.
So I've been wrestling with your sermon and deeply encouraged by it even. So I kept asking this question, so why am I mad? So why am I mad? And to get below the surface. And then you said this, and like, I don't even know if you meant to say this, if it was in your notes, but you said like, anger doesn't lump people into groups. And I was like, ooh, because, if you start to look beyond ourselves and just at the culture in general,
the broader story now.
Yes. Man, it's a lot of lumping people into groups and then like destroying them with anger.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And that was very intentional. As I looked at this story and I read a number of commentators on this story, a common thread that people were writing about this story in Mark chapter 11 is that Jesus wasn't angry with everybody in the temple. Because there were people who were there to give their sacrifices. There were regular everyday Jewish people. It was a very targeted, specific anger at a system, number one, and the religious leaders who should have known better, but were perpetuating this system. Everybody else, they people who were there would have witnessed his anger, but his anger was not directed at those individuals other than the religious leaders who were in the temple at that point. So, and the other thing with this is like, this was not new. Like, it's not like Jesus showed up at the temple one day and went, oh man, I can't believe what they just added in today. Right? Like this is something that Jesus was well aware of, and it was not a spontaneous anger. It was something that was thought out, understood, and he knew what he was stepping into when he stepped into it. So, lumping people together is one of the real dangers that we get into in our culture today. It's everybody on this side of the political spectrum is evil.
Right.
Or everybody on this side of vaccines is evil.
You put that one out there.
Right? Like whatever side you land on, we kind of get into this whole conversation of lumping everybody together, and we don't ask the question of what's the real issue, who's the real problem. And even biblically, if you want to go deeper, the real problem is what's the devil up to in all this? Like we have one enemy at the end of the day. So being able to even identify what's the devil up to that takes us off track as Christians.
Yeah, Neil even reminded us in our staff team devotions this morning, like we don't wrestle against flesh and blood.
That's right.
Like that's a helpful reminder, especially like you described that situation with your son early on, like that moment of feeling like you're out of control in your anger, like it's almost feeling like you're possessed by something else, right? Like if you get to that, you're not just upset and agitated and frustrated, that you're enraged, like there's something.
Yeah, and I've found myself, so when I scroll through my social media feed, I find myself at times feeling the tension of anger, because I'll read a whole bunch of things on social media, and if there are things that people are writing that I disagree with, I can feel the blood starting to boil, and I can feel my body getting tense. And then I often feel myself thinking, all of these people.
Yep. As soon as you say that,
right?
You know something's wrong.
Right. Because what I'm doing is I'm lumping everybody together into one group of people. And it's just not fair to do that.
Yeah. Or biblical, right? If we look at love, if we go back to the compassion conversation that Derek brought us to, like, love notices, like compassion notices people and pulls them out of crowds.
That's right.
Anger puts them in one and says, all you guys are dumb. Yeah.
Just all of you get your act together and the world would be a better place. If you all saw things the way I see them, the world would be a much better place.
You're probably right though, Kirk, on that one. Now, if we were to pull this apart, like you said earlier, anger, it's an unrighteous response to anger or something very similar to that. But there is a righteous response to anger. And and I thought you did it was really helpful for me to say like that, that anger that's unrighteous spills over, right? That you become an angry person. But you can be like, Jesus was, from all accounts, his overall character was quite compassionate and loving and patient and kind.
Yep.
And then he gets really upset here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Hebrew literature often uses those sort of as like literary devices even, right? Like that deviation from the norm says like, something's going on here, we should pay attention. And also in people's character, you're like, hey, we should notice this.
Exactly.
What's going on here? So help us to pull those two things apart, the righteous anger and that unrighteous anger. I think we've talked a lot about the unrighteous stuff. So help us to see what righteous anger would look like in practice today from a human being, not from someone who is a human being, but also God.
Yeah, so I think the first step around righteous versus unrighteous anger is whether or not this is a normal way of living for you. Like if the people around you would describe you as normally an angry person, no matter what amount of justifying you try to do to your anger, it's probably not righteous anger.
Right.
And so if this is something that's kind of coming out of, not out of nowhere, but it's just not part of your normal character, then that's probably a good sign that there's that the Spirit of God is kind of doing something in your heart to provoke a righteous anger in that kind of moment. I think too, just the ability to clarify, is this a real issue that God would actually get angry about?
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is the danger in that is we can easily justify to ourselves that God would get angry about this issue.
Right.
Right. And so what you need to do is, even in the midst of that level of discernment, the Bible talks about that there's wisdom from counsel of many, right? And so even taking a step back to understand, hey, I'm not Jesus, so I'm not entirely sure if this is righteous anger. So bring some godly people into your world, into your sphere, who aren't just yes men who are going to agree with you on everything, but people who are going to give you an honest biblical perspective on, is this something worth getting angry about? Mm-hmm. Because again, Jesus' anger wasn't a spur of the moment anger.
Right.
It was something that had time to build up to this moment, and he knew exactly what he was doing. So for us, it's that sense of anger. Righteous anger isn't just spontaneous in the moment. Righteous anger is something you are able to give some pause to, some reflection on, gain some wisdom from others. Is this something worth getting angry about in God's eyes? And then doing something with it in a way that actually is about bringing life to people, not in a way that's about destroying.
Yeah. So if can say, like, summarize it, like, if you're blowing your top,
right,
that's probably not.
Blowing your top is probably not righteous anger if you're blowing your top.
Yeah.
Although it's funny because, like I said, people who read this story, Christians who read this story, go, well, if Jesus can flip tables, so can I.
Right.
Right.
And we just want to lose our cool.
Yeah, we want to jump straight into the flipping tables part.
Not the righteous 33 years that led up to that.
Right.
And, like, the eternal existence of being God and stuff.
Exactly. Small details like that. So if your natural response is, hey, I can flip tables because Jesus did, it's just not the posture.
Right.
Right? It's not the place to be at as a Christian. But if you've done those other things and you kind of sense God stirring a righteous anger inside of you to something. So I'll give you an example. I had somebody who reached out to me today with a question about an issue they were dealing with as they looked at the news and social media and everything else. And they're like, I'm really struggling with, is this a good anger or a bad anger? And what I appreciated was they reached out to somebody to ask the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? As opposed to just losing their cool.
Throwing out a giant, 9-paragraph social media post.
Right. And trust me, I have written and deleted more of those in the last year than I have at any other point in my life. And I'm grateful I've deleted them along the way.
Yeah, internet does not age well.
No, it does not. Seeking that wisdom from other people, seeking that counsel on, is this something worth getting in? And being willing to submit to that, because there is this sense that God has called us to submit to each other,
Yeah.
that we together are the body of Christ. And so to be able to go, is this something worth getting angry over? And if good, godly Christians around you are going, it's good to get angry over this, but here's how you should express your anger over it. Listen to them rather than just your immediate reaction to the situation. I think about a guy like William Wilberforce in Slavery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like he looks around. I was reading some stuff on him a few weeks ago, and he looked around at his society and he thought to himself, like, look at all the problems in my society. Like there was just a whole bunch of things that left him feeling discontent about what he saw around him. And he asked God to show him one thing he could give his life to. So while there was all kinds of things that he felt anger over, he actually took the time to say, Lord, what's the one thing you want me to give my life to?
Man, because there's so many things today, right? Like if you
Right.
scroll through your Facebook feed or social media platform of your choosing, you can get upset about just about everything out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so he looks at slavery and he goes, well, slavery is not respecting the dignity of human beings as image bearers of God. And so this isn't honoring to God. And so I'm going to give my life. I'm angry over the slave trade, and I'm going to give my life to abolish it. And that's what I appreciate about him. He was willing to spend time with God, listening. He was willing to get angry about something that would anger God. And then he was willing to actually do something about it in a way that would give life. That's the trigger point for a lot of us, right? Because what we do is we get angry and we spout off, but it doesn't actually change anything or fix anything.
Yeah. It's another 9-paragraph social media post that does no things.
Exactly. So we end up in this space where we might feel better about ourselves in the moment because, oh man, glad I got that off my chest. But it didn't actually do anything. And what Jesus shows us in this story is that righteous anger always was something that is a catalyst to our service. And I talked about that in the message. It is this sense of you do something with it in a way that's going to bring life to other people. And even like in the case of Wilberforce, even if it takes you years and years and years to do something over it.
Yeah, because he truly like gave the rest of his life to that end, right? Yeah, I thought the springboard for service was another note that I highlighted and underlined in there because I thought, again, that's brilliant. Because if it's righteous anger, the way I sort of like reframed it in my head to understand at my level, not yours, was like it's the fruit of that anger, right?
Absolutely.
What is it producing in you and in others, right? If it doesn't produce a heart for people to change, if you're just mad at people, you're just angry. Like there's nothing righteous about that.
Absolutely.
But to say like, you know, I've got a couple of friends who are like social justice warriors who every issue under the sun gets the 9-paragraph diatribe on social media, and but a few who said, and this is the issue, and I'm going to buckle down, and I'm going to give my life to seeing this changed.
Yeah, which is amazing, and I think a reflection of what God himself is like and what he shows us through Christ and Christ's sacrifice on the cross for us. And I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday with Craig Groeschel and John Maxwell. And John Maxwell actually made a point where he said he thinks that every leader, good leadership starts with being angry about something. He says, because if you're not angry about something, you're not willing to sacrifice what it takes to change that something. And it was really fascinating. Now, he said, you know, it's not an anger, and I think he's using it in a righteous way. It's a sense of seeing something that's not okay, that's not honoring to God, and saying, okay, what can I do about this?
Right.
And honestly, like part of the reason I'm working and serving in ministry is because of that. I grew up in experiencing multiple church splits growing up as a kid. And I remember always thinking I would get angry thinking this cannot be the kind of church that Jesus dreamed of. And that stoked my fire and my calling into ministry to say, I want to be a part of helping to encourage and build up and see churches formed that are the kind of churches that Jesus dreamed of.
Man, that's really cool. I love that. So if it's a righteous anger, the fruit that it bears will be good fruit, right?
Yeah.
It's going to lead to move. I think you used the term something like at a breakdown of injustice. That's where righteous anger is born.
Absolutely.
And that we're fighting against some injustice, and we're giving ourselves not just, with words, but with our hands and lives to work to that end.
And again, we use words like injustice pretty casually in our culture right now. So always compare your definition of an injustice with God's word.
That's a good word.
And always compare your definition of an injustice not only with God's word, but with the counsel of other Christians who can help you to understand what God's word is saying about something in the moment. Because not everything that you feel is an injustice is actually an injustice in God's eyes.
There are people who needed to hear you say that, Kirk, and I'm glad you did. Now, for those who say like, okay, righteous anger, that's where I want to get to, but right now, I'm just angry. And maybe they've had that catalytic moment like you described in your conversation with Carter, but they don't know where to go from here. They say like, I'm angry and I don't want to be angry. Tell me, Kirk, how do I stop being angry?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a magical 1, 2, 3 formula.
Dr. Kirk's magic prescription.
I really wish I could. I don't think that there necessarily is. Here's what I would say. I think you really need to spend a lot of time understanding the grace of God in your life. And not just the sense of God loves you, but actually how much your sinful anger deserves the wrath and anger of God in return. And yet he chose not to give you that. He chose to give you grace and forgiveness instead. And I think that you need to step back and start to ask God, what's really going on in my heart? Why am I so angry?
Yeah, that's such a good question.
The mistake that we make all the time when we're trying to fix our anger, or most sins for that matter, is we try to change our behavior without changing our heart.
Oof.
And so we get into performance management. and so we build out a strategy. Like, I'm going to do these 3 things to stop being angry.
Right.
But Jesus tells us that that's just going to fail every single time. It might work for you for a month or 2 months or 6 months, but
Even
at the end of the day, it's going to fail. And you have to step back and deal with the heart issues. So understand grace, like really grapple with God's grace and spend time meditating, thinking about it. But then get yourself into some relationships, whether it's with a counselor, a pastor, a friend, or a group of friends who can help you figure out what's the heart of the issue.
Yeah, asking those 7 or 8 or 9 questions to get down to it.
Yeah, and then begin to invite God to come in and change your heart. Because I don't know any other way than a change of heart.
It's more simple and harder.
It is. It really is.
Now, you'd mentioned you wanted to break down a little bit more in the podcast how we actually work this out. Are there any really, I know that there's no Dr. Kirk's magic 3-point prescription for how to be not angry anymore. But are there good resources? Are there are there podcasts that you would recommend? Are there books you would recommend? Are there?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I just want to say to that. First of all, spend some time. I refer to Ephesians 4:26 where it says, "Be angry and do not sin." Excuse me. I would say spend some more time in Ephesians 4 because you need to understand that if you just sit on your anger and you don't deal with it, it turns into bitterness, and that's even worse. It's harder to get out of. And so in that context of Ephesians 4, it talks about don't let the sun go down on your anger. Because in the next verse talks about giving an opportunity for the devil in your life. And that's really what it does. If you don't deal with your anger as it's coming at you and when you're experiencing it, you are going to give a place for bitterness to grow in your heart. And the road out of bitterness is a lot more difficult and a lot more painful than the road out of anger is. And so make sure you deal with it. Don't put it off. And in light of that, the single best book I've ever read on anger, and I've read a bunch of them, is called Good and Angry. And it's by a guy by the name of David Pallison. And we are actually going to share an email with you this coming Sunday after our final sermon on the Emotion series. We're launching a new initiative this week where we're calling it a 1 degree shift. And we're going to ask you as a church to reflect on the entire sermon series and identify just one area where God wants you to kind of take some next steps in.
Cool.
And we're going to list some resources, podcast, books, things like that are available to help you take that next step. So the book will be in that email, and you'll be able to just click on it and go check it out from wherever online. And also, I would actually encourage you to, a lot of anger is because of a lot of hurt that we have. A lot of times we're angry because we're hurting. And we don't know how to express our hurt, so we express it in anger.
Yeah.
So starting next week on Wednesday night, first week of February, I'm going to be leading a class on lament. And lament is God's way of helping you to actually deal with your hurt and your pain and the things that you're disappointed and discouraged with. And it's a way of being able to express those things to God in a way that brings healing to your soul, but also gives you hope for the future as well. And so I want to encourage you, if you struggle with anger, consider taking the class on lament. I think it'll be really helpful for you.
Yeah, that like put me on my heels a little bit. That angry people are often very hurting people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've in my work with men, a lot of times when men get really angry, Christians especially will write them off and just go, it's just a really angry guy. And
you go back to that why question.
You go back to the why question, right? Instead of writing people off, step back and go, why is that guy so angry? And I would say that with most of the men that I know, most of the time it's because they're hurting, but they don't know how to express their hurt.
Yeah. I know Laura and I were talking about, we would love to take that course, but you happen to put it right when youth group runs. So is there like a later recorded version for those who can't make it Wednesday nights at 7?
We'll maybe do a replay at some
all right,
point.
we might have to do that because I'm really excited about that course. I think that's going to be really helpful. As we were going through our podcast notes, we were just sort of saying like that reminder of God's grace is really the only thing that's going to change. So I thought as we wrap up here, I'll give you, before I roll into this, any final words that you'd like to say. And then we're just going to end by reading a section of Psalm 103.
Yeah, I want to encourage people. I'm grateful that people are having an honest conversation about anger and that we can have this discussion as a church about this. I think as Christians, a lot of times we either just dismiss anger because we really don't want to dive into it, or we actually live in shame because we know we have an anger problem. We put on our Sunday face.
Yeah.
But we know what life is really like at home the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And I just want to encourage people that we want to be a church family, a church community that we're okay with dealing with the hard questions and the real issues of life.
Yeah.
And knowing that God is okay with these things too, because what Jesus came to bring all of us is forgiveness and healing and restoration. And in our anger, we can actually, when we experience anger, we can actually have a fresh perspective from Jesus about our lives if we allow him to shape us in that way.
If we're open to what he's teaching us through
Absolutely.
that, whether that's a revealing of our hurt or a call to arms for
Exactly.
some injustice that we need
Absolutely.
to work toward. So let's end our time here reading from Psalm 103. The Lord works righteousness and justice for all who are oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses and his acts to the people of Israel. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. He will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor does he repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. We love you, friends. We'll see you next week.